On January 30th, 1948, Gandhi was assassinated. He was shot 3 times in the chest by Nathuram Godse, a Hindu nationalist, while walking to a prayer meeting in Delhi, India. Gandhi died shortly after arriving at the hospital. Godse was opposed to Gandhi's efforts to promote Hindu-Muslim unity and his support for the partition of India.
He believed that Gandhi was too conciliatory towards Muslims and that he was weakening India by dividing it. Gandhi's assassination was a major shock to India and the world. He was widely revered as a Mahatma, or great soul, and his death was seen as a loss to humanity. His funeral was attended by millions of people, and his ashes were scattered in rivers and other sacred places throughout India.
In 1949, a communist government came into power in China. In 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea. Due to the intervention of the UN and Chinese troops, the Korean War developed into an international war, and both sides, concerned about the spread of the war, signed an armistice agreement. In 1953, one of the most significant was the death of Joseph Stalin. Stalin was the dictator of the Soviet Union from 1924 to 1953, and he was responsible for the death of millions of people. One of the most famous incidents that occurred in the world in 1954 was the fall of Dien Bien Phu. Dien Bien Phu was a French fortress in northern Vietnam. It was attacked by Vietnamese forces in March 1954, and it fell after a 55-day siege on May 7, 1954. The fall of Dien Bien Phu was a major turning point in the First Indochina War. It led to the signing of the Geneva Accords in July 1954, which ended the war and partitioned Vietnam into 2 countries, North Vietnam and South Vietnam. The fall of Dien Bien Phu was a significant victory for the Vietnamese people, and it helped to inspire other anti-colonial movements around the world. It was also a major defeat for the French, and it led to the end of French colonial rule in Indochina. One of the most famous incidents that occurred in the world in 1955 was the Montgomery bus boycott. The boycott began on December 1, 1955, after Rosa Parks, a 42-year-old African-American woman, refused to give up her seat on a bus to a white man. Parks was arrested for her act of defiance, and her arrest sparked a mass boycott of the bus system by Montgomery's black community. The boycott lasted for 381 days, and it ended on December 20, 1956. After the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that racial segregation on buses was unconstitutional. The boycott was a major turning point in the civil rights movement, and it helped to galvanize public support for the cause of desegregation. In October 1956, a popular uprising against Soviet rule broke out in Hungary. The uprising was eventually crushed by Soviet tanks, but it remains an important symbol of resistance to communism. The revolution began on October 23, 1956, when students in Budapest marched to the Hungarian parliament building to demand reforms. The protests quickly spread throughout the country, and the Hungarian government was overthrown. A new government was formed under the leadership of Imre Nagy, who promised to withdraw Hungary from the Warsaw Pact and to hold free elections. On November 4, 1956, Soviet tanks invaded Budapest. The Hungarian army fought back, but it was no match for the Soviet forces. The revolution was crushed. The Imre Nagy was executed.
The admission of Alaska and Hawaii to the United States in 1959 was a significant event in American history. It marked the end of the contiguous United States and the beginning of a new era of American expansion into the Pacific Ocean. Alaska was the 49th state to be admitted to the Union on January 3, 1959, and Hawaii was the 50th state on August 21, 1959. Both states had long histories of American settlement and influence, but they were not officially admitted to the Union until the late 20th century.
The Vietnam War was a long, costly, and deadly conflict that lasted from 1954 to 1975. It was fought between the Communist government of North Vietnam and its allies in South Vietnam, known as the Viet Cong, against the government of South Vietnam and its principal ally, the United States. The war began in 1954 after the French were defeated by the Viet Minh at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. The Geneva Accords of 1954 temporarily divided Vietnam into two countries, North and South Vietnam. The Accords also called for elections to be held in 1956 to reunify the country, but the elections never took place. The United States became involved in the Vietnam War in the early 1960s to prevent the spread of communism in Southeast Asia.
The U.S. government initially provided financial and military assistance to the South Vietnamese government, but in 1965, the U.S. began sending ground troops to Vietnam. The Vietnam War was a very unpopular war in the United States. Many Americans believed that the war was unnecessary and that the U.S. should not be involved in a conflict in a faraway country. There were also concerns that the war was being fought for the benefit of the fans, contractors, and other special interests. The Vietnam War was also a very costly war for the United States. Over 58,000 U.S. soldiers were killed in the war, and hundreds of thousands more were wounded. The war also cost the United States billions of dollars. The Vietnam War ended in 1975 with the fall of Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam. The North Vietnamese army defeated the South Vietnamese army, and the country was reunified under communist rule. In October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis was a 13-day confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. It was the closest the world came to nuclear war. The crisis began when the Soviet Union secretly placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the coast of Florida. The United States discovered the missiles and imposed a naval blockade on Cuba to prevent the Soviets from delivering any more missiles. The Soviets refused to remove the missiles, and the world held its breath as the two superpowers came to the brink of war. After 13 days of tense negotiations, the United States and the Soviet Union reached an agreement. The Soviets agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for the US pledge not to invade Cuba, and to remove US nuclear missiles from Turkey. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a major turning point in the Cold War. It showed that the two superpowers were willing to risk nuclear war to achieve their goals. It also led to a new era of détente toward relaxation of tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. On November 22, 1963, President Kennedy was assassinated while riding in a motorcade through Dallas, Texas. Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested and charged with the assassination, but he was shot and killed by Jack Ruby 2 days later before he could stand trial. The assassination of President Kennedy was a major shock to the world. He was a popular and charismatic leader, and his death was felt deeply by people all over the globe. The assassination also had a profound impact on American politics and society. It led to a period of national mourning and reflection, and it also contributed to the social unrest of the 1960s.
On August 4, 1964, the United States Navy destroyer USS Maddox was attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats in the Gulf of Tonkin. The Maddox fired back and claimed to have sunk 2 of the North Vietnamese boats. 2 days later, on August 4, 1964, the USS Maddox and the USS Turner Joy reported being attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats again.
However, there is no evidence that this second attack actually took place. President Lyndon B. Johnson used the Gulf of Tonkin incident to justify a massive escalation of U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. He asked Congress for and received the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which gave him broad authority to take military action in Vietnam without declaring war.
The Gulf of Tonkin incident was a major turning point in the Vietnam War. It led to the U.S. sending hundreds of thousands of troops to Vietnam and to the bombing of North Vietnam. The war would drag on for another 11 years, and it would claim the lives of over 58,000 U.S. soldiers and millions of Vietnamese civilians.
On October 21, 1966, a colliery spoil tip collapsed in the village of Aberfan, Wales, burying Pantglas Primary School and killing 144 people, including 116 children. The disaster was caused by a combination of factors, including heavy rainfall, poor drainage, and the unstable nature of the colliery spoil tip. The collapse of the spoil tip released a massive amount of mud and debris that flowed down the mountainside and engulfed the school. The Aberfan disaster was a major tragedy that shocked the world. It was the worst mining disaster in British history, and it remains one of the worst civilian disasters in British peacetime history. Thank you for watching the video, History of Mankind Part 6, provided by History and Current Events. Gina, Bella, Cindy, Helena, and Tony have contributed so far as narrators. Thank you.